Hello, this is Jeff Reichert from Veeam. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have a very informative session about ransomware, and in particular, since this is a big topic now, about some specific steps that you can take going into 2022 to protect your organization from being attacked by ransomware. My name is Jeff Reichert. I work in the office of the CTO at Veeam on the product strategy team, and I'm joined today by Dave Russell.
Hello, Jeff. Great to be here with you. I look after enterprise strategy, also in the office of the CTO, and like Jeff said, this topic is almost inescapable.
Yeah, we hear about it whenever we talk to customers, when we talk to analysts, it's everywhere now. So let's dive into ransomware a little bit. We're going to cover first off just the 30,000 foot view of the history of ransomware. Just go through very quickly what organizations are actually seeing around this threat right now, and how that's changed in 2021 and going into 2022, how the threat has evolved. We're then going to talk about some best practices for ransomware remediation, and we're going to wrap up with some resources that you can draw on and questions and answers. You can submit answers in the questions in the chat as we go through the presentation today, so please don't be shy. Feel free to go ahead and submit your questions, and we will be answering them for you. So let's dive in. If we look back at the history of ransomware, the problems that we're running into now really stem from four sources. Obviously, the rise of distributed computing, PCs, led to the ability to lock those things up. But initially, ransomware, and the first ransomware was deployed at an AIDS conference way back in 1989, was kind of limited because all of those computers were out there and they could be attacked, but the attacker had to deploy floppy disks to try to get people to encrypt their computers, to deploy the ransomware. So not really terribly efficient. That changed, of course, with the rise of the internet just a couple of years later. Now it became possible for attackers to deploy malware all over the world very quickly. They just had to trick people into making mistakes or had to find openings that had been left in an organization's security in order to penetrate it. Looking back to the first example of ransomware way back in 1989, the way that the attacker asked people to pay the ransom was to send a check in snail mail to a post office box in Panama. That also didn't scale very well for this kind of attack, but a couple of years after the internet came along, back in 2009, a much better payment mechanism for ransomware evolved as well, and that's in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So these four developments together have added up to bring us to the situation that we were looking at going into last year with the ransomware threat. All of these stats are from the antivirus company Sophos. They do a big antivirus and malware and ransomware survey every year. And Dave, looking at this, the numbers last year were pretty bad.
Yeah, they really were. I mean, if you just look at who's getting attacked, and often we hear about people getting attacked repeatedly. In fact, once you've been attacked once, and here the 2020 data said just over half had experienced attack, after your initial attack, your likelihood of getting attacked again is actually quite high. Now, during the attack, almost 3 out of 4 had data encrypted on them, and over just barely 1 out of 4 paid the ransom to recover. So part of the issue, though, here we are now nearing the end of 2021, Jeff, and the attackers are getting more sophisticated. The dwell times that we'll get into a little bit later becoming longer, and in short, it's a bit more nefarious. And the bottom stat is nothing short of frightening. You know, the actual amount, this is expressed in United States dollars, but I think really in any geography, this translates into just an absolutely staggering cost.
Yeah, so even last year, we all know what the world was dealing with. We had a global pandemic to deal with. And Dave, exactly like you say, the costs of this kind of attack were really high and were really placing a strain on a lot of organizations. Fast forward to 2021, and the picture only gets worse. One of the good stats here is that slightly less organizations, and again, this is the 2021 Sophos survey, so the same organization, 5,400 people worldwide, mostly large organizations, and a lower percentage were attacked in 2021 survey, so down from 58 to 37%. but only 8% got all their data back after paying a ransom. The average data recovered was 65%, and we saw the rise, exactly like Dave just said, of some new tactics in ransomware last year: double and triple extortion, ransomware as a service getting a lot more distributed, and all of that added up to an average cost. This isn't just the ransom being paid, but this is actually the cost of the cleanup, the cost of remediation. The whole problem, lost business, was close to $2 million in the 2021 survey. So more than double the figure that we saw in the exact same survey in 2020. And Dave, when we look at it, and this is from Veeam data, why don't you tell us where these attacks are coming from, what we've seen in Veeam survey data?
Yeah, the first thing that I think is important to call out, Jeff, is just look on the legend of the y-axis. There's 15 different items specified if we take out the unsure. 15 items specified in terms of different entrants or sources of where ransomware entered the organization. Now, we looked at this across a couple of different vectors. This is specifically overweighted towards our Veeam-specific survey, which we are in the process now of concluding this year's updated survey. But what we see jumping way out there is spam email. Look at that at 60%, and just barely the second highest. You could almost say there's a two-way tie between Trojans and remote desktop protocol, or RDP. So really, one of the things I always like to point out, because sometimes this can be overwhelming, Jeff, if you look at a list of 15 things and say, wow, do I have to lock all of this down right now? Obviously, best practice would be try to secure every aspect of this you can. But if you want to talk in terms of return on investment for your security concerns, really focusing on training the employees can help them understand the considerations involved with spam email, phishing attacks, things of that nature. And then same with RDP, remote desktop. One of our colleagues, Rick Ban over here at Veeam, that we also work with in the office of the CTO, he always likes to say that when he speaks to the person that leads Veeam's customer support SWAT team for cyber threats, his number one recommendation to data center professionals, to Veeam customers, is to scare the living daylights out of your employees so that they don't click on something, so that they don't fall victim to a phishing issue.
Yep, exactly. And look at how these grew from the 2018 survey. In particular, remote access from 5%, from a vector that accounted for 5% of attacks up to a vector that accounted for 21% of attacks. And Dave, you've heard probably the same thing that I've heard from customer after customer. Last year, I had one city in California, a Veeam customer, say that they put in place their 4-year remote work plan in 4 days. Right? That was their timeline. And when you make that kind of changes quickly, as a lot of organizations had to last year, there can be gaps left open. And I think that's what we're seeing in the survey data.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Everyone had to move fast, but now maybe hopefully people can revisit some of those things that they did implementation on.
Yep, exactly. One of the things that's going to help everyone to reconsider how they implemented remote access and how they're thinking about cybersecurity, and again, this is something that Dave and I are hearing from customer after customer, is the way the cyber insurance market has changed. Now, we're technologists, we're not here to talk about insurance, but I'm bringing this up because it has a real world effect on considerations that your organization might be having when it comes to budget, when it comes to assessing the actual risk that the organization is dealing with. Last year, the Government Accountability Office at the end of 2020 was commissioned by Congress to run a survey this year because Congress was really worried here in the United States about the state of the insurance market. They were hearing from customers, they were hearing from insurers that things had really gotten out of hand, and that if ransomware kept going the way that it was, people wouldn't be able to buy insurance anymore. That survey came out here in the US back in May. This is actually a news story from several months later. The survey painted a bad picture of the sort of crisis point that we're at with cyber insurance, and it's only gotten worse since then. These are actual insurance industry executives, and this is the link is on the slide here, so you can get that later on, that are saying that if there's not some kind of coordinated action around the cyber threat, around the ransomware threat, that they might not be able to provide cyber insurance to companies anymore. We're now at the point because industry standards are really hardening to even be able to get insurance, where the question that a lot of us are facing is, we're going to have to pay more for security than we have in the past. Do we want to pay more in insurance rates, or do we want to pay more to protect the critical data in our organization? And that's really, all of us are going to be dealing with that. If you haven't had that conversation, if you're on the technology side and you haven't had that conversation with the business side yet, I can almost guarantee you that you will soon, because they're going to be hearing things from their insurance company when it comes time to renew that will cause them to be asking you questions about what your organization's capabilities are. There's a few more things as well if we look at the current situation with ransomware and where these attacks have led us to, that are worth considering. For those of you that have any worries or concerns about what the US Treasury says about what you can and can't do, and that would include a lot of us here in North America, the US Treasury said in October of 2020 that they might start sanctioning payments to criminal organizations that run ransomware. So a company or an insurance company that paid a ransom could find itself actually being fined by the US government for giving money to a criminal organization. If you add to that the fact that even paying a ransom frequently doesn't get you the data back, if data is stolen, as frequently happens in ransomware attacks these days, and you pay a ransom, there's not really any guarantee that they will delete that data and not expose it. And as Dave mentioned before, the fact that if you pay a ransom, you are statistically, and this is a survey published in June by Cyber Reason, 80% likely to be attacked again. So bullet point one here is just don't pay the ransom, because there's a host of things that are going to go wrong if you end up needing to pay a ransom. Second point, I think we've probably all seen this a lot. If data does get breached and you're subject to a successful data exfiltration and double extortion attack with ransomware, you might find yourself having bad regulatory consequences. You might find that you've breached privacy for your customers by having your data breached, and that you've got a fine to pay. And then, Dave, something that we're hearing increasingly, and this is sort of new, we have firms like law firms, accountant firms, engineering firms that are actually having security audits done on them by their customers before doing business, as a condition of doing business, because customers are that worried about having data leaked in a successful ransomware attack or data breach, or working with someone who is then going to themselves fall victim to ransomware, and all that work that you've put into that business relationship going away. And Dave, I know you've heard the same kind of stories.
Yeah, that supply chain risk, or that concern of, you're only as strong as your weakest link, that becomes very real in a cybersecurity world and this world of ecosystems, really. So the dependencies are very significant. And I've had conversations, panel discussions where, for example, a dairy producer said, we did everything right, but the trucking company that we contracted with to get our goods and materials, to get the butter, to get the milk, etc., to the grocery stores, they got attacked. So literally we had goods rotting, perishable items that were being destroyed, and simultaneously that same dairy manufacturer had to pay a penalty for the grocery chain that they were meant to be supplying. And so even if you do everything correct, you can end up not once but twice having an issue, meaning loss of goods and fines.
Yep, that's a great story. Exactly. We're hearing this a lot now. So that's the bad news. As Dave mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the good advice from folks who have to deal with this is, let's look at the bad news straight on, because it is very serious. We are facing a very significant threat. But there are some things that you can do to avoid being victimized by ransomware. And Dave, why don't you walk us through the NIST cybersecurity framework?
Yeah, so NIST is a United States-based organization, a government organization, but we have found this is a very interesting framework or model that's applicable across the world. And this acronym CSF just means Cybersecurity Framework. It's a way that literally hundreds of organizations with some government oversight have collaborated to try to come up with a very methodological way to deal with this concern, so that you're not being only offering a reactionary kind of a posture to a very difficult problem. So you can see, if we go clockwise, Jeff, there's 5 key elements they typically go in this order, although things can quickly accelerate, meaning you could go quickly from identify to needing to respond. But these are the 5 stages. This is increasingly becoming adopted. And I know, Jeff, you and I, when we have conversations with Veeam customers, Veeam prospects, we often will use this as a backdrop, as a way to have a bit of an organizing principle. I would submit it really is not anything specific to any one government or any geography. It is just a way to look at the problem statement and how to respond.
Yeah, exactly. We internally at Veeam have adopted the NIST cybersecurity framework. It has some advantages. Dave mentioned those 5 stages. One of the nice things about this framework, and there's a lot of them out there, but one of the nice things about the cybersecurity framework is that these stages make sense even to non-technical people. If I'm a technical guy and I'm trying to explain to the business side of the house what we need to do, I can say, look, we need to identify our assets. We need to identify what the risks are around those assets. What kind of data do they have on them? We need to protect them. We need to detect if an adversary is coming on the network. We need to respond to that attack. And then we need to recover from any damage that the attack caused us. That's very straightforward. And it's even broken down more than that. If you take a look, and the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's easy to find on the web. The organization, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has published specific guidelines for different industries around how a small business can start with this, or how, if you're in banking and financial services, you can start with this, or a host of other industries. So we use it. And what's maybe even more important, a lot of what we see in the NIST cybersecurity framework, we've also driven into Veeam's product line and our capabilities. So Dave, why don't you walk us through these?
Yeah, no surprise, it begins with data. And if we think about some of the different ways that we need to go about understanding this, the framework here, we see the 5 elements, identify the attack, try to protect against the system, then try to understand if there's been an anomaly, a compromise, of course, respond in the best way, and recover from that. And it kind of grayed out there is a bit of there's a reporting notion. Now, we're showing you some Veeam specifics, but this could be applicable to really any kind of a strategy that you may have. From a Veeam perspective, RPO, probably everyone's familiar with that, recovery point objectives. Jeff, it's really looking at all the different ways that you can ingest data, the different ways that you can protect data, make it at your disposal. Tell us a little bit about the availability side.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got to protect, and then you've got to recover. And that recovery involves making sure that you can get data back when you need to, as quickly as you need to. This is really important because protecting, if I protect all my data and then I find, wow, I'm going to be down for 4 days, even though I did everything exactly like I planned, and the bad guy didn't get my backups, which is a completely separate concern. So you really need to think, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more in the next couple of slides, you need to think carefully. If I'm dealing with a ransomware attack, what I'm probably dealing with is an in-place disaster recovery exercise. It's not like a tornado has destroyed my data center, but my data center has been effectively destroyed and I'm doing a disaster recovery. And I'm doing it using data that I have to be really careful about and make sure I'm not installing any malware back into my environment. And I'm doing it onto hardware that might also be suspect. And I'm doing it all at once, right? So there are a lot of things, because typically ransomware is going to affect a large percentage of your environment. So there are a lot of things that are involved in this that we have to worry about. And just knowing that I've got my data backed up, but not thinking about the recovery time objective, how long will it really take me to get all this data back, especially if I'm suffering from a ransomware attack and maybe key building systems or key authentication systems or other parts of my corporate information network are down or suspect. So these are all things that you've got to think a lot about. I mentioned a second ago the notion of protecting backups. There's actually an interesting Gartner white paper on this that was published last week. And Dave, could you walk us through that?
Yeah, the notion here is really one of a timeline. And natural disaster, we usually have a little bit of an advantage of signaling ahead. Not always. Sometimes an earthquake happens without warning. Sometimes, though, we are have the luxury of noticing, oh, a fire could be coming in our direction, or a tsunami, a hurricane could be coming in our direction. Ransomware, on the other hand, oftentimes by the time we actually detect it, there's been nefarious activity going on for quite some time. So this timeline graph that you see depicted here, going from left to right, the threat is introduced into the backup infrastructure itself, and there's a dwell time. That dwell time could be 3.5 months, or longer, in which case there is an escalating level of damage that's probably taking place. Then the threat is eventually detected. And then, of course, the real work begins, Jeff, that you've got to quickly try to cleanse and return to normal operations. And that return to normal operations goes back to your recovery time objectives as well as recovery point, meaning you have to decide very quickly what level of backup do you have confidence in that you can actually successfully recover from. Now, there's a few steps that are highlighted here over on the left-hand side. A hardened backup infrastructure, which could include such things as least privilege access, separating your backup domain from a networking perspective from production, just almost good digital hygiene, I would describe it as, Jeff. There's nothing that's inherently new in this cyber kind of realm. It's just ways that we can appropriately try to secure an environment. Of course, keeping up to date with patches. Many of us working remotely, unfortunately, probably for the foreseeable future. So we might be down level on some of our firmware, some of our patches. That is a point of vulnerability. Looking for any changes in backup policy, especially if there were to be an internal bad actor that could be involved in suddenly now reducing the retention time. We mentioned already, but separate security context for backup servers and storage. The delineation between production and protection can't be overstated. We're going to get into this in a little bit more detail, but resilient storage, or storage that you can trust that can't be easily compromised. And like I say, we'll double click on that in a bit.
Yeah, excellent point. When we talk about the separate security context, that's very important. I actually was having a conversation with a customer yesterday, and they were very concerned about ransomware protection. And they asked the question, well, could we set the backup server up as a VM? And my answer was, yeah, you absolutely could. You could have the repository in Veeam terms be a virtual machine. But if ransomware is your primary concern, you might want to then think that if my backup storage is all on a virtual machine and my VMware credentials then get affected, I might have another vector to attack my backups that I don't want to introduce. So it's just that kind of security thinking. How would a bad guy look at my environment that this graph does tend to lay out? Securing that backup storage is a huge part of that. And Dave, why don't you walk us through the data protection zip code that we've got here?
Yeah, and many of you may have heard of the 3-2-1 rule, and if not, we'll decompose that for you. Interestingly enough, Jeff and everyone, the 3-2-1 best practice actually originated outside of the data center. It was from a digital photographer that was trying to understand how could he best ensure that he didn't lose what was essentially his intellectual property, his livelihood. And so the notion became, going from left to right, 3 or more. We should be careful to say it's okay to have more of these. This is really more of a minimum recommendation, but 3 or more different copies of your data. Now, if some of you have been in the backup industry for some time, that can sound a little counterintuitive. When we think of the sort of 2007 and on time frame, data deduplication was very much the rage. The goal is not to have one backup copy. Now, conversely, the goal is not to have hundreds of copies of your backup data, but you want at least 3 to protect against any number of different anomalies. Further, 2 or more different kinds of media. This is to protect you against firmware issues or any other kind of device issues that may come into play. I'll just bore you, Jeff. In my own life, I actually keep 6 copies of data. I actually still do have some external HDDs, but I'm predominantly external SSD, but they're 2 different kinds of mechanisms with 2 different kinds of survivability characteristics. And one of those copies or more should be off-site. That's just good disaster recovery practice. Our colleague Jason Buffington likes to say, don't forget, you have to get the data out of the building. So you want 1 copy geographically dispersed. That could help against any kind of localized concern. However, about a year and a half ago, Jeff, Veeam, we started to recommend 2 more digits. The next one that you see highlighted there in the Veeam green is that at least one of those copies, and you see the little lock icon, should be offline or air-gapped or immutable. And we'll go into a next slide of various ways you can satisfy that. But simplistically, immutable just means you cannot alter it. You can't delete it and you can't update it. So it is exactly what you got out of the production environment, and you have confidence in that because it is not alterable. Now, Veeam pioneered something quite a number of years ago. You see the 0 there, and that is an automated way to ensure that you do not have backup errors. And Jeff, there's an old joke in the backup industry. It's very difficult to recover that which you have not restored. And if you double click on that, it's very difficult to successfully restore an application or operations if it hasn't successfully been backed up. You may have part of the bits for an application, but not all of the items that you need to bring up a complex environment like an ERP system, as an example. So testing is a dying art. We recommend automated testing. We have other solutions in Veeam that can help with this, but this 32110, minimally that in scaring your employees about phishing, email, RDP will go a long, long way to helping you.
Yep, absolutely. It's interesting. Ransomware has put a much bigger focus on a lot of the elements of this. As Dave mentioned, the 321 rule has been around for a long time, but the idea that you have 2 different types of media, if a bad guy gets the admin credentials and can actually attack my production storage, it's probably good if my backups aren't sitting on that same storage array, which I know we've probably all seen at different times in our career. So these things, they've always been good practices, but the rise of and prevalence of ransomware now make them much more critical than they used to be. So let's dig in a little bit more to immutability, to what we're talking about when we look at offline, immutable, or air gap. Dave, you've been doing this for a while. Do you want to walk us through some of these options?
Yeah, the most important thing is just look at the number of them, Jeff, and everyone. There are options. And so that options could be either practices that you're comfortable with or leveraging investments that you've already made. Looking at the top one, tape, we at Veeam continue to treat tape as a first-class citizen, meaning we natively support that, including LTO9 that came out very recently. Tape is a very attractive solution, not always as your recovery of first resort, but of outstanding or fantastic recovery of last resort because of its cost structure, its portability, its durability, but it is offline and air gapped. Now, replicated VMs, assuming you power them off, that can be very interesting as well. Veeam has natively built in server-based replication. We can also support snapshot and replication through the next one there, primary storage arrays as well. We can orchestrate that. That's another method that you could choose. We have something we call Veeam Cloud Connect. It's just our mechanism. Think of it as a protocol to be able to send on-premises Veeam backups to a service provider. Offshoot of that capability is the ability to add something we call insider protection, meaning bad actors can be internally can be thwarted because a service provider can require additional steps to be made in order to actually remove or somehow alter that backup data. So it becomes a repository that is indeed immutable. Next one, Jeff, is really honestly the one that I use at home. Every night I have now 4 different external SSD drives connected through USB-C. At the end of the backup, I have those drives ejected. So it's physically attached, but in terms of Windows Volume Manager, that drive letter is not apparent anymore. It cannot be accessed unless you were to break into the home office and physically manipulate them. Those rotated drives, you can write data to one, then cascade them down to others, and then logically eject them from the system as well to create that air gap. With immutable backups, we have a few different ways that we can do that. We supported this some time ago with AWS S3 Object Lock, and now I believe, Jeff, we're at over 24 different object storage providers that can honor that capability, meaning S3 Object Lock as well. And then lastly, something that we call the hardened Linux repository that we delivered earlier this year. If you don't want to have or do not have specialized hardware, be it tape or be it something, one of these repositories, we can take a generalized server, and it's fine if you're in a Windows environment, more comfortable with Windows. We can walk through the steps, automatically set this up, where we can temporarily up privilege an administrator to get specific rights to then ensure that only data can be removed at the time frame that is specified within the Veeam backup policy. And that is such that even if someone were to come in with admin credentials, they would actually have to have physical access to the console directly to the server to be able to override that. So it's a generalized way to provide these capabilities. And if I were to net that out, Jeff, I would say choose the method that's most comfortable to you and your organization, or at this time, leveraging assets that you've got. And just understand that there's choice. There's many ways to achieve this.
Yep, exactly. And so we've got a lot of choices of media. One of the key things to think about, particularly if we're dealing with ransomware, we're back to that in-place disaster recovery scenario, Dave, that we talked about a minute ago, is if my entire environment is compromised and I have to get back many hundreds of terabytes or petabytes of data to get up and running again, then how long is that actually going to take? And how long is it going to take depending on where I've put my data? Dave mentioned that we've got, for example, a lot of S3 compatible options for immutability. That can be either on-premises S3 compatible storage. So we have many storage partners that do on-premises storage that have that object lock with compliance mode so you can protect it, or it can be in the cloud. But just like with any other system, you need to think carefully about it when the time does come to restore. What is going to be the weakest link in that chain? What is going to be my constraint? If I've got, for example, a 10 gigabyte link or a 10 gigabit link to storage up in the cloud that I'm recovering my backups for, and I need to get back many petabytes of data, I could be looking at the cost of recovery going up quite a bit just because of the laws of physics, because there's a limited amount that I can get over a single connection in a certain amount of time. Even if the backup infrastructure on one side and the server and storage infrastructure that I'm recovering to could take more, could take the data faster, if my network connection isn't going to be able to scale up to that, then I'm going to find myself in a lot of pain as I slowly recover. This is one of the reasons, and I'm going to just go right back and we'll look quickly again, if you don't mind, at that slide we just looked at. This is one of the reasons that it's important to have options in the way you do things, that you don't just assume everything is going to automatically be one way. Maybe it is critical for long-term retention or for ultimate disaster recovery to have that copy of data offsite, but I might also want to have a copy on-site in immutable storage so that I can most times be able to recover very, very quickly at much faster multiplex sort of network speed on-prem. It's just something to think about when you're designing. Think about the recovery you're going to have to do. Dave, there's one particular option that Veeam has had for quite a while around this, and that's instant recovery. Do you want to walk folks through that?
Yeah, and when you went through the Veeam overlay of the NIST cybersecurity framework and you took the recovery side of that, it's important to understand all the different options that you've got. And to your point, Jeff, 11 years ago, Veeam pioneered instant recovery of data. This diagram could look busy, so let's just quickly unpack it. You've got workloads over on the left-hand side, a variety of different virtual machines that's representing multiple different hypervisors, different physical servers, different cloud instances or file shares, NAS, etc. Once we bring that into our Veeam backup and replication repository, and we can skinny that down, compress it, deduplicate that, there's multiple ways we can bring that back. Now, specifically though, there's actually 91 ways we can bring that back. We've got a poster on that. But specifically, if we look at from an instant recovery perspective, we can instantly mount that VM, we can instantly mount that disk, we can instantly mount SQL Server, Oracle, or we can instantly mount a NAS or file share. And by instant, it is not predicated upon just having high-end infrastructure such as SSDs, although if we have faster infrastructure, we can perform even faster. But the whole point here, Jeff, is regardless of workload on the left-hand side, and regardless of the recovery that you wish to perform on the right-hand side, Veeam has not only pioneered this, but has the broadest, most complete set of instant recovery on the market. And it is not dependent upon having what I call a cache hit, meaning it must be one of the more recent backups, because then it must be on local SSD, or kind of all bets are off. Back in a world when we actually did get together face to face, I remember our colleague Rick Vanover demonstrating version before last, a year and a half ago now, a little over, in version 10. We're currently at version 11A as of last week. But in version 10, a year and a half ago plus, he did a side-by-side comparison in a hotel ballroom, going over a network to a lab in Columbus, Ohio, going to a deduplicated hard disk drive storage appliance, a purpose-built backup appliance, and he compared the versions of Veeam prior to that and then current Veeam. And we've done so much optimization in terms of IO prefetching and understanding the streams that even if it's going over a low bandwidth, higher latency network, even if it's paying the deduplication rehydration tax, and even if it's HDD, not SSD, we were still able to bring a machine up faster compared to prior release. So this is something that we continue to rev on every single iteration. But what does this mean from a customer perspective? Get back up and running faster.
Yep, exactly. And again, hearkening back to the cost of downtime in the Sophos survey 2021, 1.85 million on average. That's not mostly the ransom cost. That's mostly the cost of being down, missing business, damage to reputation, and the direct expenses that you incur trying to clean your environment out and get your data back. So anything that can speed that up is a big help. Now, since we're talking about cost, let's talk really, really briefly again about the insurance topic. What Dave and I are hearing from customers is that, especially because of the optics of ransomware, especially because entire industries like the cyber insurance industry are paying a lot of attention to this, the budget change, the budget conversations that our customers on the tech side of the house are having with the financial side of the house have significantly changed. We are not talking about incrementally improving performance or incrementally adding a new feature for our customers or for our users at this point. We're talking about an existential threat to our organization. And the folks whose job is to manage existential threats to the organization, to actually keep the business running, are aware of that. And increasingly, if you have this kind of a conversation with them, you can, again, ask the question, would we really rather pay double or triple the insurance premium for cyber insurance that we paid last year? Or would we rather protect our data and get a discount on our insurance and actually be in a much better, more resilient position if we are unfortunate enough to be attacked by ransomware? There's kind of a good story about this. I will turn this over to you, Dave, because you know how one of our customers dealt with this. And you also know what we saw from our colleague Anthony Spiteri here in the office of the CTO in a demo that he did a little while ago.
Yeah, I like this one because it actually combines a number of the advantages inherent within Veeam. These are two different tweets that you see our colleague Anthony tweets out. He's commenting on a product release that we had in the beginning of 2020, version 10. So he's saying, hey, there's a lot of features I really like in version 10, but leveraging the cloud tier construct we have where we can automatically move data to a cloud repository for low recovery point recovery time by mounting that object storage repository is one of the coolest. This is a bit of an instant recovery of sorts. Just a little quick screenshot there, and just the green box just says we externalized the ability to just go and right click on an object store. In this case, the bucket is an AWS example. And you can right click on that, select import the backup, and start streaming that data. So why does that sound interesting? Well, prior to being able to externalize this import backup, it was a registry key hack that our Veeam support would offer if someone was hit by ransomware. So our head of product management said, well, wouldn't that be neat if you actually tried this in a disaster situation, and even neater if you could prove that you didn't have to have a lot of resources to do that. So the right-hand tweet, if you can kind of see the graphic, That is a picture of Australia. That's Anthony on Qantas airline flying from his home in Perth to Melbourne, Australia. He is going over a very low bandwidth, high latency link to Amazon. He didn't even have to take a pre-installed version of Veeam. He could download what we call the community edition, our free version of the product, because Veeam writes data in a self-describing way, and we have data portability associated with that. Now, coupling that with the ability to instantly stream that after we import the object bucket. So I rattled off 4 technologies, but what does it really mean, Jeff? Well, it means that a fresh install of the product, no metadata, no catalog, backup catalog needed. You do, of course, have to know your object storage, your bucket credentials. But once those were inserted, instantly streaming back data even on an airplane. An interesting academic exercise that became extremely real just a couple of months later for one of our customers.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is a great Veeam customer and expert. I know Dave has spoken at a couple of conferences at this point, was at the Veeam On Before Last. So walk us through this story.
Yeah, this was one of our service provider colleagues, a customer that has a managed service offering, happens to be a Veeam Vanguard. That's one of our highest levels of Veeam evangelists. He got a call Monday morning. He's based in Canada. His customer was a very large oil and petroleum company. Monday morning, there is a call with a picture that was sent on the text. And the picture is a blue screen of death, if we're familiar with those terms. And the entire system was bricked, meaning locked out. There was very nefarious attack, primary storage attacked, the Veeam backups on premises attacked, firmware upgrades made to many of the infrastructure components. And of course, what was coming up on the screen was, you owe this amount of ransom. Make matters worse, people went to go, if they were to try to do a daily activity like print a document, instead of their document, what came out of the printer was, you have been successfully hacked and your company's IT must pay this ransom. Long story short, that's Monday morning. They happen to be, instead of AWS, which was the previous example with our colleague Anthony, they happen to be sending Veeam backup data to Microsoft Azure. They contacted Microsoft and said, can you open up a more networking pipe to help alleviate some of the challenge that you had mentioned earlier, Jeff? They were able to stream all of the data back. Same exact scenario. They were using our service provider's Lenovo laptop with a fresh install of Veeam just to be traffic cops. So there's no catalog associated with that. There's no recover that environment, the backup environment first. It was just input the credentials of Azure, start streaming back data. Thankfully, Microsoft opened up more networking connectivity. Long story short, the end of the week on a Friday, all systems were recovered. There was no data lost. There was no ransom paid. And there was a tweet that actually was pretty funny. It said, I'm a Canadian and I'm going to go out and play hockey tonight because we got all our data back. One of the postmortems that they learned from this, Jeff, was that they probably could have saved a day to a day and a quarter off of that. So been back up and running Thursday afternoon if they had had more automation around building their systems with infrastructure as a code. Meaning, to your point about sometimes, it takes longer to get the whole system set up, not just the bits are involved. Well, they had to set up brand new networks, brand new servers, reinstall applications. Veeam was able to bring back the data faster than they could actually stand systems up and get operational. But it's a great win. It's a great example of, in a real world scenario, combining many of the different technologies that we've been discussing.
Yes, absolutely. Especially, and I love this, we have over 10,000 active partners that are part of our Veeam Cloud service provider community worldwide, and it really can help. And we talk to a lot of customers who like the idea that they can get an expert that knows Veeam very well to help them out with this process that maybe they've gone through more times than the individual customer's gone through because they're a service provider. So I hope this has been informative, folks. If you would like to know more, there's a very recently published white paper that Dave and I contributed to, along with our colleague Chris Hoff, and cybersecurity marketing expert here at Veeam, on 7 key capabilities that you need for a rapid and reliable recovery from ransomware. The link to this is at the bottom of the page. We encourage you to check it out. The list on the left lists those 7 key capabilities, and none of them are going to be a big surprise. They cover a lot of the same sorts of things that Dave and I have gone through today. So please do check that out. Also, if you're interested, October 13th here in the Americas and October 14th in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and in Asia Pacific region, we're going to have the update to our annual Veeam On user conference. That is going to be a very full morning of good content for end users, and for Veeam partners, we're also going to have sessions in the afternoon about some new things that have just come out in the product. Dave mentioned that version 11A just came out. There's a lot of goodness there for our customers and for our service provider partners. So strongly encourage you, if you've got time next week on those days, please do register, take a look, and join us at Veeam On Update here on October 13th and October 14th. So thank you so much for your time, really appreciate it. I will say goodbye now. Again, this is Jeff Reichard in the office of the CTO here at Veeam, and I will let Dave sign off as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.